Welcome back, traveller. Before tonight's mystery begins, if you enjoy these stories, make sure to subscribe and leave a like so you don't miss more of these late night tales. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin. London in October is a city that pulls its collar up against the world. The leaves on the plane trees along Baker Street had turned the colour of old leather. They had mostly fallen. The street itself was damp and grey and smelled of coal smoke and wet stone, and the sharpness of autumn settling in to stay. The gas lamps were already lit at 4 in the afternoon, which tells you everything you need to know about October in this city. I arrived at 4:30, stepping out of one moment directly into another, the way I always do. No warning, no process, just the sudden cold and the lamp smell and the sound of horse hooves on wet cobblestones and the knowledge, arriving with the same certainty as the cold, that this was exactly where I was meant to be. Baker Street. I knew it immediately. I walked to 221B and knocked, and Mrs. Hudson opened the door with the expression she always wore when she was uncertain whether to be pleased. She settled, as she always settled, on a version of both. "He's upstairs," she said. "He's been at that thing since morning." I went up. The sitting room was warm and crowded with its own disorder, the way it always was: papers in stacks, chemical apparatus on the sideboard, correspondence pinned to the mantelpiece with a jackknife. The violin was on the sofa. The skull on the mantelpiece had acquired a fresh stain on its left temporal that I had not seen before and did not ask about. The fire was high and good, the kind of fire that Mrs. Hudson built when she was worried about someone. Sherlock Holmes was at the table. He was not eating, though a plate of food that had clearly been there for some hours sat at his elbow, untouched. He was not reading, though several books lay open around him. He was not doing any of the things that the room suggested a man might do in it. He was looking at silk. A bolt of fabric lay unrolled across half the table, its length trailing off the far edge and pooling on the floor. Even from the doorway, across the width of the room, I could see that it was extraordinary. It was the colour of deep water in winter, not quite blue, not quite grey, with a sheen that shifted as the firelight moved. The pattern woven into it, flowers and leaves and birds of a kind I couldn't quite name at this distance, rendered in the silk itself with a precision that made you think of scientific illustration rather than decorative art. It looked like something that belonged in a museum case. It looked like something built, not woven. Holmes had a magnifying lens in his hand. He was looking at the fabric through it at a distance of approximately 2 inches. He was completely still. "Come and look at this," he said without turning. I crossed the room. He moved aside slightly to give me room at the table. I leaned over the silk. Through the lens, the pattern resolved into something even more remarkable than it appeared to the naked eye. The precision of the weave was each thread crossed and interlocked with its neighbours, with an exactness that suggested not just skill, but a deep mathematical understanding of how structure creates surface. The birds in the pattern I could see now that they were doves, turtle doves, a recurring motif that ran across the full width of the fabric, were rendered in individual threads of cream and soft gold so fine that the individual filaments were barely visible even through the lens. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "Lestrade brought it this morning," Holmes said. A man was pulled from the Regent's Canal at first light. No papers, no wallet, no identification of any kind. Someone had gone through his pockets very thoroughly before he went into the water. He straightened and looked at the silk. Someone had not, however, checked his coat lining. This was sewn in there, approximately 2 yards, folded and stitched. "Hidden," I said, "with great care." The stitching that concealed it was neat and practiced. It was done by someone who knew how to use a needle. He set down the lens. The body is at St. Bartholomew's. Lestrade is waiting for us. I looked at the silk once more before we went. In the firelight it moved slightly in a draught from somewhere, and the doves in the pattern seemed, for just a moment, to stir. The sitting room at 221B Baker Street was, in that October, a room that felt as if it had been composing itself for this case. Holmes's cases always left their residue in the room, the papers accumulated on the desk and the side tables. The chemical apparatus moved to accommodate whichever reference was most recently consulted, the violin abandoned on the sofa, with the bow across it at the angle of an interrupted thought. The room was not untidy in the way that disorder is untidy. It was untidy in the way that intensive work is untidy, everything displaced from its ordinary position by something being actively pursued. On the shelves above the desk, the reference volumes Holmes kept on textile history and material culture had been pulled forward. He had 3 of them open simultaneously when I arrived, their pages held back, with whatever came to hand a magnifying lens on one, the jackknife on another, a chemical retort stand on the third. Mrs. Hudson came up with tea while Holmes was still at the table, and she set it down with the wordlessness she adopted when she judged that words would be unwelcome, and departed. The tea sat and cooled. Holmes ignored it. I drank mine. The bolt of silk lay across half the table at close range. In the lamplight, it had a quality that photographs cannot capture, a quality of surface responsiveness to light that makes fine silk one of the most visually alive materials ever produced. As the lamplight moved slightly in a draught, the color of the fabric shifted through a range of blues and greens and greys, never settling into any single statement of itself. The turtle doves in the pattern were rendered in threads of such fine caliber that the individual filaments were barely visible even when you leaned close, and their wings caught the light differently depending on the angle. They looked, from certain angles, as if they were about to move. The warmth, Holmes said at one point, still looking at the silk through his lens. What warmth? The colour. It reads as cool blue, grey, the colours of deep water. But in person, with the lamplight on it, there is warmth in the weave. The threads are not purely blue or purely grey. Each thread is a gradation. He set down the lens. This is what makes the depth. This is the technique. Vautier wasn't weaving a pattern, he was painting with thread. He stood and moved back from the table, looking at the silk from a distance. From here, he said, look at the right-hand border. I looked. From a distance of 8 feet, in the lamplight, the right-hand border of the silk produced a distinct impression of dimensional space. The botanical elements in the border, leaves. Small flowers appeared not to sit on the surface of the fabric, but to recede into it, as if a 3-dimensional form had been pressed into the cloth and fixed there. Extraordinary, I said. The French called it illusione's tisse, Holmes said. Woven illusionism. The technique exists in the scholarly literature, but the actual examples from the period are because the knowledge of how to achieve it was not widely disseminated. Most weavers who attempted it produced something competent but flat. Vautier's examples are the finest known. He came and stood beside me, looking at the border. And somewhere in Lyon, in a workshop, the family that held this knowledge has been producing it for 170, while the Ravenswood family displayed the design and sold work derived from it, and called it their heritage. He went back to the table. The silk in that frame in the Belgravia hall, he said. Did you notice its colour? The same as this one, I said. Not quite, he said. Similar. The pattern is reproduced faithfully. But the depth, the dimensional quality, the Ravenswood silk was printed, not woven in the Vautier manner. Someone in the Croft or Ravenswood operation learned the design, but not the technique. He set the photograph on the table, which means the silk on the dead man was not produced by Ravenswood. It was produced by Vautier, by Auguste, in Lyon, on his own loom. And he brought it to London as proof not just that the design was his family's, but that the technique was his family's. We took a cab. The journey was the journey through London that it always was, horse hooves on wet stone, gas lamps blurring past the cab window, the smell of the city doing its autumn work. Holmes sat with his hands folded and his gaze directed inward at whatever he was assembling in there. The silk, I said. Late 17th century in origin, he said. Or a very precise copy of a late 17th century design. The pattern is French Norman in its botanical reference, Protestant in its symbolism. The turtle dove was the emblem of the Huguenot silk weavers who came to London after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. They were French Protestants fleeing Louis Sib's persecution. They settled in Spitalfields in the East End, and they built the finest silk weaving industry England. He turned and looked at me. The turtle dove in the pattern is not decoration. It is a signature. Whose? That is what I need to determine. He looked at the window. The weavers of Spitalfields kept meticulous records. They had to. The Weavers' Company controlled the trade, and membership and design attribution were matters of legal. The designs themselves, the point papers, the punch cards, the pattern books, were the most valuable intellectual property a silk weaver possessed. They were worth more, in some cases, than the looms themselves. Could someone steal them? They were stolen. The designs for English silk were highly sought after, not just in England but by French and Italian competitors who wanted to understand how the Spitalfields weavers achieved what they achieved. There were documented cases of agents hired specifically to obtain pattern books. He was quiet for a moment. There was one particular theft. A family named Vautier, Jean-Pierre Vautier, a master weaver who had come to London in 1687, produced a series of 7 pattern designs that were considered the finest of their generation. They were not merely beautiful, they were technically revolutionary. The manner in which Vautier achieved his colour gradations and his 3-dimensional surface depth was something that had not been done before in England. What happened to the patterns? They disappeared, Holmes said, along with Jean-Pierre Vautier himself. He died in 1723. His workshop burned. His family dispersed. Some returned to France, some went to Canterbury, some simply vanished into the record. He paused. An English merchant named Aldous Croft acquired the Vautier workshop site in 1724. Within 5 years, Croft's silk business was the most profitable in Spitalfields. He was producing designs that, to the eyes of anyone who had seen Vautier's work, bore a remarkable resemblance to what the Vautier family had been making. I looked at him steadily. He stole the patterns. He acquired them by means that were never formally examined. The Vautier family were French Protestant refugees with limited legal standing in England. Croft was English, established, and well connected. The theft, if it was a theft, went uncontested. He looked at the passing street. The Croft family became the Ravenswood family in 1812, when the current family's great-grandfather changed his name for reasons related to a substantial inheritance he was in line to receive from a different branch. They have been the Ravenswoods ever since. They are one of the wealthiest silk merchant families in London. They maintain a house in Belgravia and an office in Commercial Street in Spitalfields, and the silk on the dead man, I said, bears the Vautier pattern. It bears what I believe to be the Vautier pattern, Holmes said, carefully. I cannot confirm this without seeing the original point papers, which are, if they exist at all, somewhere in the archive of the Weavers' Company at Guildhall, or in private hands. What I can tell you is that the pattern on the silk in my sitting room is of a sophistication that places it far beyond anything an ordinary weaver could produce from observation alone. To weave this, you would need the original design instructions, the point papers, which means whoever had the silk also had the papers. Or was taught from them, Holmes said, or knew someone who was. The cab stopped. The mortuary at St. Bartholomew's had the quality Victorian institutional buildings, not unkind exactly, but built by people who had decided that function was its own form of dignity and had arranged things accordingly. It smelled of carbolic and the cold that stone produces when it never quite warms up. Lestrade was waiting in the corridor with his coat on and his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who has been waiting longer than he expected. "Holmes," he said, and he looked at me. "A colleague," Holmes said. Lestrade looked at me the way he always looked at me, with the provisional acceptance of a man who has learned that Holmes's associates are rarely what they appear and are usually worth tolerating. "He came out of the Regent's Canal near Cumberland Basin," Lestrade said, leading us through the corridor. The canal men found him at first light. He'd been in the water 6 to 8 hours by the surgeon's estimate, which puts him in the canal sometime between 10 and midnight. "Cause of death?" Holmes said. "Blow to the back of the head. The water didn't kill him. He was dead before." Lestrade pushed open a door. "Nobody knows who he is. Nobody's reported anyone missing." The dead man lay on the mortuary table covered with a sheet that Lestrade pulled back with the briskness of someone who has done this many times and has learned not to make ceremony of it. He was perhaps 65, perhaps a compact, broad-shouldered man with white hair cropped close to his head and the hands of someone who had worked with them all his life. The hands were the most remarkable thing about him. They were large and strong and marked across the palms and finger joints with a fine pattern of callus and small scar that accumulates over decades of a specific kind of manual work. The tips of the fingers were especially notable, slightly flattened, thickened, with a texture like fine sandpaper. Holmes was already examining them. He was a weaver, Holmes said, within 30 seconds. A hand-loom weaver of the finest grade. These calluses are specific to the operation of a draw loom, the mechanism used to produce the most complex silk patterns. The right hand shows the marks of shuttle work, the left of heddle control. He has been weaving for at least 40 years. He looked at the man's clothing, which had been laid out to one side. His suit is English cut, but not English make. French. I think the stitching at the shoulders is done in a style I associate with the tailors of Lyon. He was not wealthy, but he was not poor. He came from somewhere, with a purpose. From France, I said. From somewhere he had been living in reduced circumstances for some time, but not. Holmes moved to the clothing. He examined the coat lining. The place where the silk had been concealed was still visible as a gap in the stitching where Lestrade's men had removed it. Holmes studied the gap with the lens. He sewed it in himself. The stitches are made by the same hands that wove the silk. You can see the way the needle was held, the angle of the stitch. He was a man who worked in silence with thread all his life. "Who killed him?" Lestrade asked. "That is a question for tomorrow," Holmes said. "Tonight we know who he was, or rather tonight we know what he was. He was a Vautier." Lestrade looked at him. "I'll explain later," Holmes said. "What I need tonight is the full report from the canal men. What was happening on the Regent's Canal? Who was seen there? Who was not seen there? What boats were moving? And I need access to the Weavers' Company archive at Guildhall tomorrow morning." Lestrade made a note. He had long since stopped questioning Holmes's requests at the operational stage. He questioned the conclusions, always, but the requests he wrote down. Outside, the October night, the fog was coming up off the Thames and spreading northward. In the lamplight it was amber and opaque, and turned the streets into a series of small warm rooms connected by dark passages. "A vaultier," I said as we walked. "How certain are you?" "Not at all certain," Holmes said pleasantly. "It is a hypothesis. The silk suggests a connection to the Vautier family and their designs. The man's hands suggest a weaver of the highest caliber, and the Vautier family were, by all accounts, the finest weavers of their generation. The French tailoring suggests he came recently, where if there are surviving Vautier descendants, they would most likely have settled, given the history." He flagged a cab. "I need to confirm the design first. Everything else follows from there." The Guildhall Library opened at 9 the following morning. Holmes was there at 8:30. I found him when I arrived at 9, already deep in the Weavers' Company archive, surrounded by boxes of fragile paper that the librarian had brought with the careful reverence of someone who has been entrusted with things that don't make good replicas. The archive ran from the 17th century forward, covering membership, design attribution, legal disputes, and the technical records of what was produced by the Spitalfields silk industry. Holmes had gone directly to the records of 1685 to 1730. "Here," he said when I sat down across the table. He had a box open in front of him, and in it lay a series of large sheets, perhaps 18 inches by 12, covered in a grid of tiny markings made in ink by a hand so practiced that the regularity of them was itself beautiful. They were point papers, the design instructions from which a pattern was woven on a draw loom. Holmes set one of the sheets alongside a photograph he had taken of the silk from Baker Street that morning. He aligned them carefully, the photograph showing the full width of the fabric and the point paper showing the corresponding section of design. They matched. Not approximately. Not closely. Exactly. The turtle dove in the photograph corresponded to the turtle dove in the point paper grid, with the precision of a copied document. Every thread position, every color instruction, every mathematical relationship between the elements of the design. "Jean-Pierre Vautier," Holmes said. He held up the box's label, his personal archive. "Design series number 3. La Tourterelle the Turtle Dove." He set it down. "And the silk on the dead man was woven from these papers." "These papers are here," I said. "Not with the Ravenswoods." "This particular set, yes, they were acquired by the Weavers' Company in 1889, a donation from an unnamed benefactor, according to the acquisition record." He turned the record book toward me. The donation came with a note requesting that the papers be preserved and not made available to commercial parties for commercial purposes. The note is unsigned. He paused. Someone knew these papers were dangerous. Someone donated them to the safest place they could find and asked that they not be exploited. And someone else had copies, or the originals, and wove the silk from them. "There are 7 designs in Vautier's series," Holmes said. "This archive holds 5 of them. The acquisition record notes that 2 were missing when the donation arrived. 2 designs not in the archive. 2 designs that are somewhere else." He closed the box carefully. "The silk on the dead man corresponds to which is here, and therefore could have been copied from this archive someone who had access to the Guildhall. Or it could have been woven from an independent copy." He looked at the ceiling. "The Ravenswood family. Let me think about the Ravenswood family." He was quiet for 3 minutes. I had learned to let those minutes run. Aldous Croft stole the Vautier designs in 1720. He used them to build the Croft fortune, which became the Ravenswood fortune. 3 generations of prosperity built on patterns that were not theirs. The Vautier family dispersed. Some returned to France, spent the next century and a half in a reduced state, their inheritance gone. He stood. But they knew what had been taken. and the same care that made Jean-Pierre Vautier the greatest weaver of his generation also made him the most meticulous keeper of his own archive. He moved toward the door. I need to know who the dead man is, and I think the way to know that is to find whoever he was in London. He came from France to find the Ravenswoods, I said. He came from France to collect a debt, Holmes said. He had the silk with him to prove his claim. Someone did not want that debt collected. The Regent's Canal ran through a northern slice of London that the city had built around in the decades since the canal's construction, so that what had once been a working waterway at the edge of things was now a waterway running through the middle of things, through Camden and Islington and the industrial districts that had grown up alongside it. At night in October, it was a black mirror in a dark frame, reflecting the lamps on the towpath in long amber lines. We stood at Cumberland Basin on the canal where the body had been found. Holmes was looking at the water. He was put in here, he said, not further along. The canal men are precise about where bodies travel in the hours after entry the current, such as it is. The structure of the basin. This is where he entered the water. He looked at the towpath. It was worn smooth by decades of horse-drawn barges and foot traffic. The basin itself was wide, the water dark and still in the October calm. The basin is accessible from 3 approaches, he said. The towpath from the east, the towpath from the west, and the private yard of Kellerman, whose premises run to the edge of the basin on the northern side. He was looking at the northern edge. Someone brought a body here after dark and put it in the water. They came from one of those 3 approaches. He crouched and looked at the edge of the towpath. This is a soft stone. Old, it marks. He brought out his lens. I leaned over. In the soft surface of the old stone edging, just at the waterline, there were marks. The marks of something having rested against the edge with weight, 2 parallel impressions separated by perhaps 3 feet. The kind of marks a boat would leave. Kellerman's boat hire, Holmes said, rising. The proprietor of Kellerman's boat hire was a solid man of 60 named, unsurprisingly, Kellerman, who received us from behind a counter that smelled of linseed oil and tallow, and a very specific smell of old rope. He had the squinting assessment of a man who spends his working life reading customers. Holmes was direct. A boat went out from this basin last night, he said, between 10 and midnight. It came back. We know because the marks on the stone at the basin edge are fresh, and were made from inside the basin rather than the canal, which means a boat that had been out returned here rather than continuing. Kellerman looked at him. I have a small man called Parker who minds the boats at night, Kellerman said. He sleeps on site. I'd like to speak to... Parker turned out to be a young man in his early 20s, with the sleep disheveled look of someone recently woken, and the careful expression of someone thinking hard about what he should or shouldn't say. Holmes looked at him for approximately 4 seconds before speaking. You know something, Holmes said. You've been deciding since Kellerman came and got you. You've decided to tell it, which is the correct decision. The man who used one of the boats last night put a dead man in the canal. What you tell me might help us find out who that dead man was. Parker sat down on a wooden crate. There was a gentleman came round about 9:30, he said. Not a customer, not one of ours. He came round the back way. He said he needed to take one of the small rowboats for an hour, and he'd pay. I said it wasn't proper business, we didn't hire out that way. He put 3 sovereigns on the crate there. Describe him. Tall, well-dressed, dark coat, maybe 45, 50. He had a Parker paused, a look about him, like a man who was used to getting what he paid for. His hands, smooth, gentleman's hands. Did he return the boat? About 10:45. He came back through the yard. He wasn't, he was very quiet. He walked quickly. He had lost the three sovereigns attitude, if you know what I mean. He was doing the thing people do when they want to look ordinary and that makes them look less. You saw no one else with him? When he went out or came back? No one. Good, Holmes said. You've done the right thing. Is there anything else, anything at all that you noticed about this man? Parker thought. He had something on his coat, he said, when he came back. Down the front of the coat, on the right side. I thought at first it was mud from the canal bank, but it wasn't the colour of mud. It was lighter, almost yellow. Holmes looked at me. Silk thread, he said quietly. Raw silk is that colour. He was carrying the dead man, and the silk in the dead man's coat lining caught on his own coat and left threads behind. He turned back to Parker. If you see this man again on the canal, in the yard, anywhere near these premises, you are to come directly to Scotland Yard and ask for Inspector Lestrade. Not tomorrow, immediately. Can you do that? Parker nodded. We walked back along the towpath to the street. A gentleman, I said, 45 to 50. Smooth hands, well dressed. Someone the dead man agreed to meet, Holmes said. The dead man came to London with the silk as evidence of his claim. He made contact with the Ravenswood family, or someone connected to them. He arranged a meeting, possibly a meeting at which the claim was to be settled, money to change hands, the matter resolved. Instead, he was killed. He walked quickly, his hands in his coat pockets. I need to know more about the Ravenswood family, not their commercial history, their personal history. Who makes decisions in that family now? The Huguenot Society, I said. You mentioned last night that the Vautier family kept records. If there are surviving Vautier descendants, they may have contacted the Huguenot Society at some point. Yes, Holmes turned his head. The society has been active since 1885, documenting Huguenot genealogy and history. If a descendant of Jean-Pierre Vautier came to England in the past year, looking to establish a claim, they might well have started. The offices of the Huguenot Society were in a building off the Strand, up a flight of stairs that had the creak of old wood, carrying important documents for 100 years. The Society's secretary was a neat woman in her 40s named Miss Isabeau Rondeau, whose name told its own story, and who received us with the precise, efficient warmth of someone who spends their professional life connecting people to their pasts. Holmes explained what we were looking for. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Monsieur Auguste Vautier, she said. Holmes was absolute. He came to see us in September, Miss Rondeau said. He came from Lyon. He was the last surviving member of the direct Vautier line. Jean-Pierre Vautier was his great-great-great-grandfather. He had documents, family records going back to 1685. He also had, she paused, he had point papers. 2 of the original design series, Design 1 and Design 7. The 2 missing from the Guildhall archive, Holmes said. I didn't know about the Guildhall archive, she said. He didn't mention it. He said the papers had been in the family since Jean-Pierre's death, passed down, carefully preserved, because the family understood that what had been taken from them was documented, and that one day, if they could prove the theft and its extent, there might be recourse. Did he explain what he wanted? She looked at him steadily. He wanted to speak to the Ravenswood family. Did he make contact with them? I gave him a letter of introduction. The Ravenswood family are known to the society. They have presented themselves over the years as patrons of Huguenot heritage. They sponsor the annual lecture series. She looked at her hands briefly. I wrote to Lady Cecily Ravenswood on Monsieur Vautier's behalf, explaining that he was a descendant of the Vautier family and wished to discuss a matter of historical importance. And Lady Ravenswood agreed to meet him, she said. The meeting was arranged for 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, I said. He's been in London for 2 weeks. He was staying at a lodging house in Shoreditch, Miss Rondo said. She produced a card from a file. He left this address with us. He said he would contact us again when the matter was resolved. Holmes took the address. He has been in the Canal since midnight, Holmes said gently. I am very sorry to tell you this. Miss Rondo absorbed it. She sat very still for a moment. The meeting with Lady Ravenswood, she said. Did it go wrong? I don't yet know what went wrong, Holmes said, only that it did. The lodging house in Shoreditch was run by a Mrs. Kepler, who had the alert. Information holding quality of a landlady who understands that she is, in many cases, the last person who knows anything about her lodgers before they cease to be knowable. She confirmed that a Frenchman named Vautier had taken a room 6 weeks ago. She had found his room empty that morning, but had assumed he was out. Holmes examined the room with his characteristic speed and thoroughness. It was a small room with a bed and a desk, and a window looking into the yard below. On the desk, a pen, an ink bottle, a French-English dictionary worn soft with use. In the wardrobe, 3 changes of clothing, all clean and pressed. Under the mattress, a leather satchel. In the satchel were the point papers. The 2 missing designs, Design 1 and Design 7 of Jean-Pierre Vautier's series, folded with care into protective paper, carried across the Channel and across London in the lining of a satchel by a man who knew exactly how valuable they were, and beside them, folded in a different paper, a letter. Holmes read it twice. Then he handed it to me. The letter was in French, which I read adequately. It was written in a formal hand that had aged into something slightly tremulous with age, but remained completely legible. It began, my dear Clest. I write this before my meeting with Lady Ravenswood, in case the meeting does not. I want you to know that the papers are safe and the claim is sound. Jean-Pierre Vautier's record is complete. If anything should happen to me, take the papers to the Guildhall Library and ask for the Weavers' Company archive. Tell them everything. The claim is for the 7 designs and the revenue they have generated across 174 years. I do not seek to destroy the Raven. I seek only what was taken from ours. Remember that. Your loving grandfather Auguste Clest, Holmes said, reading over my shoulder. His granddaughter, I said. She's in London. She is, he said. He says the meeting does not go as I hope, which means he was uncertain about his welcome. He anticipated danger. Holmes looked at the letter. He came to London with his She is somewhere in this city, and she doesn't know yet that her grandfather is dead. Do you know where she is? Holmes looked at me. He wrote to tell her to take the papers to the Guildhall, which means she wasn't here with him. She's somewhere else, somewhere he could write to her separately. He folded the letter carefully. There is one more thing. The meeting with Lady Ravenswood 2 weeks ago, what happened at it? I need to speak to someone in that house. He was already moving to the door. Baker Street that evening was cold and clear, the fog having lifted, the stars visible for once above the amber glow of the city. Holmes was at his desk with 3 reference books open, and the Ravenswood file, a file he had apparently been assembling for some years, in the manner he assembled files on families of interest spread around them. I sat and watched him work. The Ravenswood family, it emerged, consisted of Lady Cecily Ravenswood, a widow of 73, who had run the family's silk trading business with considerable acumen since the death of her husband 14 years ago. She had 2 sons, who was 47 and who managed the commercial side of the business, and Arthur, who was 42, and who Holmes described without elaboration as the less consequential of the 2. She had a staff of 12 at the Belgravia house and a further staff at the commercial street. Edward Ravenswood, Holmes said. 47. Parker described our Canal man as 45 to 50. Well-dressed, smooth hands, accustomed to getting what he paid for. He looked at the photograph in the file clipped from a society newspaper, a man at some civic occasion. Dark-coated, tall, the precise bearing of someone who has spent their life in money. But we need to know for certain, I said. We need more than that. We need to understand what happened at the meeting 2 weeks ago, and what the Ravenswood family decided to do about Auguste Vertier's claim. For that he paused. The letter to Clest. He writes to her as if she is reachable quickly, as if she is somewhere she can receive a letter within London, not in France. Here he looked at the letter again. My dear, I write this before my meeting. He calls her Clest, not Mademoiselle, not Cry, the natural address between a grandfather and a granddaughter. He was very still suddenly. She is in London, not in Shoreditch with him. Working, she would need work, a young Frenchwoman in London, educated, capable, a governess, I said. Holmes looked at me. How many French governesses are currently employed in the houses of London's silk merchant families? He said, rhetorically, he reached for a different set of papers. The employment registry. Licensed domestic staffing agencies. The Ravenswood house has a staff of 12. He ran his finger down a column. He stopped. Mademoiselle Clest Aubert, engaged as governess to the Ravenswood household from the 8th of October. He looked up. 3 weeks ago. 1 week before Auguste Vertier arrived in London and came to the Huguenot Society. The sitting room was very quiet. She went in first, I said. She went in first, Holmes agreed. She presented herself as a French governess. She is French. She is educated. She is capable. She obtained a position in the house of the family, whose patriarch killed her grandfather's inheritance a century and 3/4 ago. And she has been inside that house, with access to documents and correspondence, and the private conversations of a family who had no idea who. She's gathering evidence, I said. She has been gathering evidence. While Auguste came to London and made the formal approach, the letter of introduction through the Huguenot Society, the meeting with Lady Ravenswood Clest has been inside the house watching what happened. He stood. And last night, someone killed Auguste Vertier. And tonight, Clest Aubert does not know her grandfather is dead. She is in that house with those people. He was already reaching for his coat. We can't go there tonight, I said. Not without a plan. If we arrive at the Ravenswood house and demand to see the governess, we don't arrive at the house, Holmes said. Not tonight. He stood at the window, looking at Baker Street. She is in no immediate danger tonight. If Edward Ravenswood killed Auguste, and I believe he did then, he believes the threat is eliminated. He doesn't know about Clest. He doesn't know that the granddaughter exists, or that she is under his roof. Can you be sure he doesn't know? Holmes was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I cannot be sure. He turned from the window. Tomorrow we will go to the Ravenswood house at 9 o'clock, when the household is at its most public, and therefore its most constrained. We will ask for Lady Ravenswood, not Edward, and we will find a way to speak to Mademoiselle Aubert before anyone else does. He sat back in the armchair and pulled the file toward him. In the meantime, he said, "Tell me what you know about the revocation of the Edict of Nantes." I told him what I knew. Not everything I knew, the outline. The history of French Protestant persecution. The mass exodus of skilled craftsmen from France in 1685. The 250,000 people who fled to England, Germany, the Netherlands, South Africa, the Americas. I told him about the Spitalfields community, about the tall houses with the wide weavers' windows in the upper stories that you could still see on Fournier Street and Wilkes Street. Holmes listened the way he listened when he already knew most of what you were saying and was attending for the detail he didn't already know. Jean-Pierre Vautier came to London in 1687, he said, 2 years after the revocation. He established his workshop in a house on Princelet Street. There is a record in the Weavers' Company archive of his admission as a foreign master in 1688. He was 20, he turned a page. He had a wife, Marie Threes, and 3 children. He wove the 7 designs between 1690 and 1720 over the course of 30 years. Each design took, by his own account, between 3 and 5 years from concept to final pattern. 30 years of his best work, I said. The accumulated craft of a master's prime working life, Holmes agreed. And then in 1720, Alderscroft came to him. The records of what happened between them are not in the archive, or if they are, I haven't found them yet. What I know is that in 1720, Jean-Pierre Vautier began losing customers. His wholesale agreements were not renewed. His access to the best raw silk from the Levant, merchants, the Ottoman traders who supplied the finest raw material to Spitalfields, was suddenly restricted. He said someone was systematically cutting him off from the commercial networks that sustained him. Someone who had better connections and more money and was willing to use both. Croft, I said. Croft, who wanted the patterns and understood that the way to obtain them was not to steal them directly that would be actionable, but to starve the man who held them until he had no choice but to sell. By 1722, the Vautier workshop was failing. By 1723, it burned. Jean-Pierre Vautier died in the fire, or so the record states. He paused. The record states that the fire was accidental. A lamp overturned in the night. You don't believe it was accidental. I believe that a man who had spent 30 years building something irreplaceable would not accidentally overturn a lamp among his life's work. Holmes looked at me. I believe Alderscroft obtained the designs by starving Jean-Pierre Vautier commercially, and when Vautier finally refused to sell, Croft took them by other means. And I believe that the fire was the means. The fire in the Baker Street grate shifted. Coals settled. And now, I said, 174 years later. Auguste Vautier carries the last proof of the theft across the Channel. He arranges to meet the family that has profited from it for generations, and he ends up in the Regent's Canal. With a hole in the back of his head, Holmes said, made by something blunt and heavy from behind. He didn't see it coming. He looked at the ceiling. He trusted them. He thought the meeting would be civilized, a negotiation, a settlement. He paused. He was wrong about what kind of people he was dealing with. The fire continued its quiet work. The clocks on the mantelpiece counted the distance between that moment and morning. One more thing, I said. The silk itself. You said he carried it sewn into his coat lining, 2 yards of it. Why bring the silk at all if he had the point papers? Holmes looked at me with the expression he wore when a question had found something he was still working on. Because the point papers prove what was designed, he said slowly. But the silk proves it was woven. It proves that someone, recently in the past decade, perhaps the past 5 years, wove from those designs, that the designs are still alive, that they are still being used. He paused. Someone wove that silk from Vautier's patterns, and Auguste Vautier brought it to London as evidence that the Ravenswood family was still using what they stole, even now. Who wove it? I said. That, Holmes said, is the question I keep returning to. We were at the Ravenswood house in Belgravia by 9. It was the kind of house that costs the same as a small country estate to run and looks at white stucco facade, iron railings, steps of clean Portland stone, a door of polished black with brass fittings that reflected the morning like a mirror. The kind of house that announces, without speaking, that the people inside it have been wealthy for long enough, that wealth itself has become invisible to them. Holmes knocked. The butler who answered was the kind of butler such houses produced, impeccably trained, impeccably composed, with the courtesy of a man who has been taught that courtesy and refusal are not in conflict. Holmes presented his card. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I have a matter to discuss with Lady Ravenswood that concerns the family's interests. It is of some... The butler processed this information with the speed and efficiency of long practice. The name meant something to him. He admitted us to the hall and left us there. The hall was what the house promised: marble, gilt mirrors, the stately accumulation of several generations of good taste and better money. On the walls, interspersed with the usual portraits, something else framed pieces of silk, displayed like paintings, mounted behind glass, each one labelled with a small brass plate. Holmes went directly to them. I followed. The first was a deep crimson brocade in a formal floral pattern. The label read, "Specimen of Croft Manufacturing, circa 1730. The second was a gold and ivory stripe of extraordinary refinement. Croft Manufacturing, circa 1745. The third Holmes had stopped in front of the third. I stopped beside him. It was mounted in a larger frame than the others, double the width. The silk was the same deep watercolour as the fabric that had been sewn into Auguste Vautier's coat lining. The pattern was the same botanical precision, the same turtle doves rendered in cream and gold thread at the border. The label read, "Finest example of Croft production, early 18th century." The turtle dove design, a treasured part of the Ravenswood family heritage. "La Tourterelle," Holmes said, very quietly. "Displayed in the house of the people who stole it." A door opened at the far end of the hall. A woman of perhaps 73 came through it. She moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who has been the person in charge of a room for 50 years and finds no reason to rush. She was dressed plainly and well, with white hair pinned back and dark eyes that assessed Holmes, and assessed me with the efficiency of someone accustomed to assess. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I know who you are." "Lady Ravenswood," Holmes said. "Thank you for seeing us. I wonder if we might speak privately." "This is private enough," she said, remaining where she was. "What do you want?" "I want to talk about Auguste Vautier," Holmes said. Something happened in her face. It was not a dramatic change. A tightening, perhaps, a small decision made very quickly. "I don't know that name," she said. "You met him 2 weeks ago," Holmes said pleasantly. "He came with a letter of introduction from the Huguenot Society. He presented himself as a descendant of Jean-Pierre Vautier, who created the La Tourterelle design you have on your wall." He gestured at the framed silk. He brought evidence with him, point papers from the original design series. Lady Ravenswood was quiet for 2 seconds. "He was a fraudster," she said, "a man claiming a heritage he had no right to. He was a weaver of 70 years old who came from Lyon with documents going back to 1685, Holmes said. He was found in the Regent's Canal yesterday morning with a blow to the back of his head. He is dead, Lady Ravenswood." The hall was very still. "That is a terrible thing," she said, "but it has nothing to do with this family. Your son Edward met with him. After your initial meeting, Edward Ravenswood met with Auguste Vautier privately. I believe the meeting did not go as Vautier hoped. I believe the meeting went as far as Edward Ravenswood decided it should go, and no further." He paused. "I am giving you the opportunity to tell me what happened before Inspector Lestrade arrives with a warrant." The colour had left Lady Cecily Ravenswood's face. It had not returned. "Where is Edward?" she said. "I have no idea. Where is he?" She looked at the door at the end of the hall for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at the framed silk on the wall, La Tourterelle, displayed in the house of the family that had built its fortune on it for 174 years. She looked at it for a very long time. I was watching her face, which was the face of a woman deciding something immense. and I was watching Holmes, who was watching her with perfect patience, not pressing, not speaking, understanding that the moment required silence. "He was here," she said finally. "Vautier. He came with his papers, and he was not wrong, Mr. Holmes. I could see that immediately. The papers were genuine. The claim was genuine. The La Tourterelle design was not ours. It never was." She looked at the silk again. "I have known this for 30 years. My husband knew it. His father knew it. The knowledge has been in this family for 100 years, buried under prosperity and silence." She turned back to Holmes. "I sent for Edward," she said. "I told him we needed to make a settlement, a fair settlement, whatever that meant, money, acknowledgement, whatever Vautier required. I told Edward it was over, that the claim was real and we would not fight it." She was very still. Edward did not agree. "He arranged to meet Vautier privately," Holmes said. "He told me he would handle it," she said. "He said he had spoken to their solicitors and there was a way to contest the papers, to challenge the chain of ownership. He said it was not as clear as I believed." She looked at her hands. "I believed him, or I wanted to believe him. There is a difference." "And 2 weeks passed," I said. 2 weeks passed," she agreed. "And now you're telling me Vautier is dead." "Last night," Holmes said, "in the Regent's Canal. Hit from behind, put in the water." He paused. "I need to speak to Mademoiselle Aubert. I need to speak to her now, privately, before anyone else in this house becomes aware of what I'm here for." Lady Ravenswood looked at him. "The governess," she said slowly. "Mademoiselle Aubert." Something moved in her face again. "She came 3 weeks ago, from an agency, very competent, very self-contained." She stopped. She knew him. "She is his granddaughter," Holmes said. Lady Ravenswood sat down on the hall chair, heavily, without elegance, the way someone sits when their legs have decided the information is too much for standing. "She's been here for 3 weeks," she said. "She's been in this house." "Gathering evidence," Holmes said. "Carefully and methodically, in the way that people who have been waiting for 174 years for a moment learn to be patient." He moved toward the stairs. "Which room? Lady Ravenswood?" She said it. He went up. I waited in the hall with Lady Cecily Ravenswood, who sat in the chair by the wall and looked at the framed silk of La Tourterelle with the expression of someone finally letting themselves see something they have been looking past for a very long time. "Your family has shown it," I said, "all these years." "On the wall, because we were proud of it," she said, "because it was the finest thing we had, and because no one who saw it knew what it meant." She was quiet. "Jean-Pierre Vautier. He died in a fire. He had a wife, 3 children. They lost everything." She paused. "I used to tell myself it was so long ago, that the people who did it were long dead, that the people who suffered from it were long dead." She looked at her hands, and then Monsieur Vautier walked through my door, and the suffering was standing there in the room in front of me. Holmes came back down the stairs. Behind him was a young woman of perhaps 25. She was composed in the manner of someone who has learned that composure is the best protection available to someone in a difficult situation. She had dark hair and dark eyes, and the upright bearing of a person who has been keeping secrets, and has decided that the moment has arrived to stop keeping them. She looked at Holmes. She looked at the hall. She looked at the framed silk on the wall. "My grandfather," she said. Not a question. "Come and sit down," Holmes said. "I have some." What followed, in the small sitting room off the hall that Lady Ravenswood made available to us, was one of the most difficult half hours I have witnessed in my time with Holmes. He told Cleste Vautier what had happened to her grandfather, and he told her with the directness and simplicity that the truth requires, and that false kindness can only worsen. She listened. She was very still, very quiet, the way someone is when they are absorbing something enormous and are not going to allow themselves to fall apart because there is still work to be done. When he finished, she said, "I have the evidence." "Tell me," Holmes said. She told him. She had been in the Ravenswood house for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, she had done exactly what Auguste had asked her to do. She had watched, and she had gathered. She had been careful and patient, and she had used the access that a governess has in a Victorian household, which is considerable. The nursery is on the same floor as the family bedrooms. The servants' passages connect every part of the house. A careful, quiet person who has made herself invisible and useful can move through a large house, seeing a great deal. She had found Edward Ravenswood's study on the 3rd day. She had not entered it, because entering it without invitation was... But the study door was left open sometimes, in the evenings when he was elsewhere, and she had stood in the corridor and observed what she could observe from a doorway with the patience of someone who had been told her entire life that the evidence was there if you looked for it. She had observed a file on Edward Ravenswood's desk, a legal file, dark green, unmarked, but whose contents she had partially seen on the one occasion when a draught from the window had lifted the top page while she stood in the corridor. The letterhead, she said. It was from a firm of solicitors. I read the first 3 lines before the page fell back. It said, "In the matter of the Vautier claim." It said, "The documentation presented Vautier is, in our view, legally sufficient to sustain a claim in Chancery." She looked at Holmes steadily. They had been told the claim was real, she said. Edward Ravenswood had a legal opinion telling him the claim was real. And he didn't tell his mother that. He told her there was a way to challenge it. He decided to eliminate the claim by eliminating the claimant. Holmes, "He didn't know about me," she said. Grand Prix had not told them I was here. He was protecting me. Her voice was level. He protected me. And it killed. "He also left you instructions," Holmes said. "His letter. Take the papers to the Guildhall archive. Tell them everything." She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a small envelope. She set it on the table. "He gave me a copy," she said. "A copy of the letter. He sent the original to the lodging house in Shoreditch." She looked at the envelope. He was very careful. He always said, "A good weaver keeps 2 copies of every pattern, in case of fire." Holmes looked at the envelope for a moment. "Mademoiselle Vautier," he said, "I need to ask you something. The silk, the La Tourterelle design, your grandfather brought 2 yards of it with him, sewn into his coat lining. He wove it recently in the past 5 years, perhaps, to prove the design was still being used by..." He paused. "Where did he weave it?" She looked at him. For the first time, something changed in her face. Not grief. Something else. A kind of quiet pride. "In Lyons," she said. "On his own loom. The same loom his grandfather used, and his grandfather before that. It is a draw loom from 1730, and it still works perfectly." She looked at the envelope on the table. He kept Grandpapa Jean-Pierre's 2-point papers, Design 1 and Design 7, in a drawer under the loom. He wove from Design 3, which was published in a book in 1892, A History of Spitalfields Silk, where it was reproduced in simplified form and which he was able to reconstruct with the pattern he held in memory. She paused. "We have been weaving from the Vautier patterns in Lyon for 100 quietly, privately, selling locally, not to England, not wanting to provoke the family who had what was ours. But this time you came," I said. "This time my grandfather was 71 years old," she said, "and he decided that 170 years was long enough." Lestrade arrived at the house that afternoon with 2 constables. Edward Ravenswood was not there. He had, it emerged, left the house that morning at 2 hours before we arrived in a hired cab with a travelling case. He had told his mother he was going to the Commercial Street office. He had not gone to the Commercial Street offices. The stations, Holmes said to Lestrade: Victoria, Charing Cross, London Bridge. He'll be trying to reach the continent. They found him at Charing Cross, not trying to board a train, as it happened. Standing at the far end of the platform in the specific stillness of a man who had gone somewhere with a purpose and then, somewhere between arriving and acting, had found the purpose insufficient. He didn't resist. He said very little. He confirmed to Lestrade's constables that his name was Edward Ravenswood. That was all. Later, Holmes would describe what he thought had happened in Edward Ravenswood's mind on that platform. A man of 47, the manager of a family business built over 174 years on a theft, who had made a calculation 2 weeks ago that the theft could be protected by one more act of violence, and who now understood standing on a station platform in October with a travelling case and nowhere particular to go, that the calculation had been wrong. Not just legally wrong. Wrong in the way that matters at the bottom of everything. He had known, Holmes believed, since his mother sat him down and told him about the Vautier claim, that the design on the wall of the family hall was not theirs. He had known it the way people know things they have decided not to think about. And when the knowledge walked through his front door in the form of a polite old man with papers, he had made the choice to end the matter permanently rather than face what the matter actually was. He was protecting the fortune, Holmes said. But a man who understood only that would have boarded the train to Dover. He was still standing on the platform. What was he protecting? I asked. Holmes looked at me. That is always the question, isn't it? When the thing that looks like pragmatism turns out not to be. He was protecting something he couldn't have named if you'd asked him to. The feeling of being a Ravenswood, of being the kind of person who lives in a Belgravia house with the La Tourterelle silk on the wall. He paused. When that feeling is built on a lie, and the lie is exposed, the protection of it starts to look like the most important thing in the world. And then you are standing on a platform with a travelling case, and there is nowhere to go, because the lie is the only place you have ever lived. The legal proceedings that followed occupied the better part of a year. Edward Ravenswood was charged with the murder of Auguste Vautier, and with fraud the possession of the Vautier designs under false claim of ownership. The murder charge was the easier one, given Parker's evidence from the Canal yard and the Canal side marks and the threads of raw silk. The fraud charge was the more complex, and its resolution took longer than the murder trial. Lady Cecily Ravenswood, in an act of considerable courage that Holmes described as the first genuinely free decision she had made in 30 years, testified fully about the family's knowledge of the Vautier claim's legitimacy. The settlement of the Vautier claim occupied 3 separate chancery proceedings and eventually resulted in a payment to Clest Vautier, the sole surviving heir of Jean-Pierre Vautier's line, of a sum that was, by any measure, less than what the designs had generated over a century and 3/4. It was more than anyone had expected, given the age. The La Tourterelle silk was removed from the Ravenswood Hall. It is now in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum, in the Textile Gallery, displayed alongside a full account of its history and the history of Jean-Pierre Vautier. The label reads, "Design and manufacture attributed to Jean-Pierre Vautier, 1658, 1723. Huguenot master weaver, Spitalfields." The 2-point papers that Auguste had carried in his satchel Design 1 and Design 7 were donated by Clest to the Guildhall archive, completing Jean-Pierre Vautier's series for the first time since 1723. Holmes heard about the museum acquisition several months after the proceedings concluded. He was at the Baker Street desk with a file of an entirely different case. He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. Then he went back to the file. That evening he took the violin from the sofa and played by the fire for perhaps 2 hours. I sat in the other chair and let him. The music was not sad exactly, but it was not entirely comfortable either. It was the music of something that required two states of feeling, at once the recognition that an injustice and the recognition that addressing it had cost a man his life and a family its sense of itself. Holmes played it without drama. The fire kept its steady work. The clocks on the mantelpiece counted time the way they always did, patient and precise, in the manner of things built to outlast the people who built them. "The silk," I said, at some point in the second hour. "In the museum. People will walk past it and read the label and not understand what it cost. Most of what is in museums cost more than the labels say," Holmes said, without stopping playing. "That is not a criticism of museums. It is simply the nature of preserved things. The cost of preservation and the cost of what is preserved are two different things. They almost never match." He played on. "I thought about Auguste Vautier in a lodging house in Shoreditch, writing a letter to his granddaughter before a meeting he was afraid might go wrong. I thought about Clest, 25 years old, going to work in the house of the people who had taken her family's life's work and presenting herself as a governess, and doing the quiet, patient, dangerous work of gathering evidence for weeks without anyone knowing who she was or what she was building. She was in Lyon now. Holmes had received a letter from her, brief and precise, reporting that the Chancery proceedings had concluded and that she intended to return to her work in the city. She had thanked him in 3 sentences and had asked him to pass her thanks to his associate, which was me. He had given me the letter and said nothing. I thought about Jean-Pierre Vautier, dead in a fire in 1723, and whether he had, in the last moments, whether what he had built and hidden had survived. The 2-point papers in his granddaughter's grandfather's satchel carried across the channel. The loom in Lyon, working from Vautier's designs for 170 years in quiet private continuance. The silk that Auguste had woven design 3, La Tourterelle, the turtle dove, and sewn into his coat to carry across the water to the city where it had been taken from, the doves in the pattern. The canaries that the Huguenot weavers kept in cages beside their looms to entertain themselves while they worked. The birds in the silk, which had survived everything. The Regent's Canal in autumn has a specific character that I have not encountered in any other part of London. The great city surrounds it, presses against its banks from both sides, fills the air above it with its smoke and its sound. And yet the canal itself persists in its own register, slow, dark, bordered by its towpath trees that still held their yellow October leaves above the black water, indifferent to the urban urgency on all sides. Narrowboats moved along it with the unhurried pace of things that have their own internal rhythm and do not consult the city's schedule. Ducks moved in the margins. A heron stood on the opposite bank and looked at the water with the monumental patience of a creature that has been fishing this stretch of canal for the entirety of its long life. We walked the towpath east from Cumberland Basin for perhaps a quarter mile before Holmes stopped. "Here," he said. There was nothing to see. An ordinary stretch of towpath, the stone edging worn smooth, a dock ring for mooring corroded to an orange stain. The water on the other side of the bank was deeper here, the far bank sheer and bricked. If you wanted to put something in the canal with confidence that it would not immediately drift back to the bank, this was the stretch to choose. Holmes was looking at the towpath surface. I came and stood beside him. "Boot marks," he said. "Heavy ones. A man of considerable size carrying a substantial additional weight. The mud between the stones has taken an impression. He pointed without touching. The marks were faint, they would have been imperceptible to anyone not looking for them, but they were there. 2 sets of depressions in the mud between the path stones, made by the same boot, tracking from east to west, the coming and the going. He carried the body from the east. He came from the direction of Kellerman's yard, as we established. He crouched and looked at the track in the mud for a long moment. He carried him, he said, not dragged. Carried. The depressions are too even for dragging. A drag weight creates an uneven rhythm, the drag point pulling on one side. These are the marks of someone walking with a dead weight in their arms. He straightened. A man of 47, in reasonable physical condition, would be capable of carrying an old man of 65 over a distance of 100 yards. Capable, but not comfortable. He would have moved quickly. He looked at the water. He put him in at the deepest point, where the far bank is bricked and the water is cold and still. He expected the body not to be found for longer than it was. The canal men were early, I said. They always are. It is their canal. They know when something is wrong with it. Holmes turned back toward the direction we had come. Edward Ravenswood. He met Auguste Vautier privately after Lady Ravenswood's initial meeting. He had the legal opinion in his file that confirmed the claim was real. He met the old man, I imagine, in some neutral location, ostensibly to negotiate, and he made the calculation that killing him was simpler than paying him. He walked. What he did not understand was the nature of what he was dealing with. Vautier had spent his life being patient. He had a letter in reserve, his granddaughter in the house, the point papers in his satchel. He was not a man who had come to London without preparation. He thought he could buy silence, I said. Or he never intended to buy it. There are people who, when confronted with a legitimate claim against them, do not ask how much the settlement will cost. They ask how much the removal of the claimant will cost. Edward Ravenswood appears to be that kind of person. He was quiet for a moment. His mother is not. We turned off the towpath at the bridge and walked up. I want to describe the Weavers' Company archive more fully because it deserves description. It occupied 3 rooms in the Guildhall library rooms that felt like the inside of history rather than the container of it. The shelves ran floor to ceiling, and on the shelves were boxes of the kind that archivists use, stiff cardboard, labelled in faded ink, many of them dating from when the Victorian archivists of the 1860s and 1870s had undertaken the considerable task of organising what the centuries had accumulated. The records inside those boxes were extraordinary. They covered everything the Weavers' Company had governed: the admission of master weavers and apprentices, the resolution of disputes between journeymen and their employers, the regulation of wages and hours and working conditions during the periods when the Spitalfields Acts had made these legally. There were lists of designs submitted for attribution, the mechanism by which a weaver could establish legal ownership of an original pattern. There were accounts of pattern thefts, prosecutions, and settlements. There were letters from weavers describing the conditions of their trade in terms that were sometimes technical and sometimes desperate, and some. Holmes worked through the records of 1690 to 1725 with the systematic attention of a scholar who is reading for a signal against a background of everything else. He turned pages without haste and without impatience, the lens in his hand for the close examination of particular passages, his handwriting working steadily in the small notebook beside him. I read. The language of the period was dense and formal. The Latin abbreviations of legal practice intertwined with the technical vocabulary of the silk trade, which had its own terminology as complex and precise as the patterns themselves. Draw loom, point paper, tabby, brocade, damask, paduasoy, the vocabulary of a craft that was, in 1700, the most technically demanding in England. Jean-Pierre Vautier appeared in the records from 1688 onward, his admission as a foreign master, his registration of the first turtle-dove pattern, La Tourterelle, in 1692, his payments to the company's registration fees, his disputes, minor ones, regarding a journeyman who had left his employ and sold information about his methods to a competitor resolved in his favour. And then, from 1718 onward, the record changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious to someone not reading carefully, but the disputes became more frequent and the nature of them shifted. A wholesaler who had supplied Vautier's workshop for 20 years suddenly terminated the arrangement without explanation. A mercer who had been buying the Vautier silk for Mayfair dressmakers stopped placing orders. A supplier of raw Levant silk raised his prices to Vautier to a level that was, as the record noted in a neutral clerk's hand, inconsistent with the prices charged to other master weavers. Someone was squeezing him. "Look at this," Holmes said. He had a page open. I looked over his shoulder. It was a letter dated March 1720, written by Jean-Pierre Vautier himself in a French accented English that the clerk had clearly transcribed rather than translated. The letter was addressed to the masters and wardens of the Worshipful Company of Weavers. It described in careful and specific terms the situation Jean-Pierre had found himself in, the cancelled agreements, the inflated prices, the customers redirected to a competitor. It named the competitor, Aldous Croft. It asked the company to investigate whether Croft had engaged in deliberate commercial interference, what would now be called restraint of trade, to drive Vautier out of business. Below the letter was the company's response, dated April 1720, polite, formal, and entirely unhelpful. The company had considered the matter and found no evidence of improper conduct. The committee responsible for this decision listed 3 names. The first name was Aldous Croft. Holmes read the response, set it down, and said nothing for a full minute. He sat on the committee that investigated his own conduct, I said. He was a member of the company's governing court, Holmes said. He had the influence to direct the investigation, select the committee, and determine the outcome. He turned the page. And then in 1723, Vautier's workshop burned, and in 1724, Croft bought the site, and in 1725, Croft began producing silk that was the equal of anything Vautier had made. He closed the box. The record is clear. The legal standing of the record at this distance is a different question, but the moral account is completely legible. He stood and began to pack his notes. The Ravenswood family, he said, has been living on the proceeds of a crime committed by a man on a committee investigating his own conduct in 1720, and every generation since has chosen, one way or another, to keep living on those proceeds and not to ask too carefully about where they came from. He picked up his coat. Families do this. They inherit not just money, but the decision not to look at how the money was made. The not looking becomes a tradition as durable as the money itself. We walked out into the city street. The Guildhall behind us, grey and grand. The October morning around us, grey and particular. People moving in the direction of their various purposes. Can the legal case be made? I asked. The Chancery claim? That will be for solicitors to assess, not me. He turned north toward Holborn. What I can do is give Lestrade the evidence he needs for the murder case, and I can help Cleste Vautier understand what she has and what she can do with it. The rest is law, and law, as ever, moves at its own pace and reaches its own conclusions. He walked in silence for a moment. There is something else, he said. The silk. the 2 yards that Auguste brought in his coat lining. The Ravenswood family has displayed La Tourterelle on their wall for generations as evidence of their family's heritage. Auguste brought the same design as counter-evidence proof that the Vautier family still understood the pattern, still wove from it, still held the knowledge that created it. He paused. What I find extraordinary, what I have been thinking about since I first examined it, is the quality of the weaving itself. It's exceptional, I said. Even I could see that. It is beyond exceptional, Holmes said. Auguste Vautier wove it on a loom from 1730, in Lyon, in his 70s. The technique he applied, the color graduation, the three-dimensional surface depth, the precision of the bird rendering is precisely what the V&A experts describe as the defining quality of Jean-Pierre Vautier's original work. The same techniques applied with the same authority 200 years later. He looked at the street. The knowledge was passed down, weaver to weaver, father to son to grandson, kept alive in practice, not just in theory, not preserved in a box, worked, made real in thread and silk every season, in a Lyon workshop, by a family that had lost everything except what they could make. They kept weaving, I said. They kept weaving, Holmes agreed. While the Croft family and then the Ravenswood family displayed the designs they had stolen and called them heritage. The Vautiers wove them in private and called them practice. I find I have more respect for that than for most things I encounter. The lodging house in Shoreditch, in Auguste's room there, was one more thing I should account for, because Holmes went back to it the morning after we met Clest. He went back not to look for evidence the room had been thoroughly examined, but to find something he had noticed on the first visit and had not yet fully assessed. Under the desk, in the corner that the wardrobe shadow covered, a small object. A shuttle, a loom shuttle, carved from dark fruitwood, palm-sized, the shape of a flattened boat that every weaver carries as their basic working tool. This one was old. The wood had the patina of decades of handling, worn smooth at the grip points where thousands of passes through the loom had polished it. Carved into the wood on the underside, small but clear, the initials JV. Jean-Pierre Vautier's shuttle, carried from Spitalfields to France in 1723 and back to London 272 years later in the pocket of his great-great-great-grandson. Holmes held it for a moment. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at the initials. Then he wrapped it carefully in a cloth from his pocket and brought it back to Baker Street. "For Mademoiselle Vautier," he said, setting it on the desk, "when all of this is concluded." He said nothing else about it, and I said nothing else about it, and it sat on the Baker Street desk for the weeks of the legal proceedings, and then it was sent, wrapped in the same cloth, in a package to Lyon. The proceedings themselves I will not describe at length. The murder trial was straightforward in its facts and its resolution, if not in its emotional weight. Edward Ravenswood maintained his silence throughout most of the preliminary proceedings, said very little in court, and was convicted on the evidence of Parker's testimony, the Canal side marks, the silk threads identified by a forensic examination as raw silk of the precise grade used in the Vautier workshop, and the testimony of Clest Vautier, who described in clear and measured French translated for the court every piece of evidence she had gathered in her 3 weeks in the Ravenswood house. She was an extraordinary witness. Holmes had observed that she was building her case with care during her time in the house. Watching her presented in court confirmed what he had suspected. She had been doing this her entire life. The patience of someone raised on a story of injustice, told carefully and respectfully, so that the injustice was understood as something to be addressed rather than simply suffered. The clarity of someone who knew exactly what she had and knew exactly how to use it. After the murder conviction, she did not return to France immediately. She stayed in London for another 3 months, working with the solicitors on the Chancery claim. She attended every procedural hearing. She answered every question. She provided every document. Holmes saw her once more in that period, briefly, when she came to Baker Street to return some papers he had lent her from his research. They spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. I was present. She said, at some point in the conversation, my grandfather thought it would be easier. He thought coming with the papers and the silk would be enough. That people would see and understand and do the right thing. Holmes looked at her. He was not wrong about what the papers showed, he said. He was wrong about the response they would produce. He trusted them, she said. He should not have. No, Holmes agreed. He should not have. He paused. But the trust itself, the willingness to believe that a legitimate claim, honestly presented, will be received honestly, is not the weakness it looks like from here. It is the thing that kept your family coming back, generation after generation, rather than abandoning the claim and the memory entirely. The trust that justice was possible, even if it turned out not to be the case in his own lifetime. She looked at him for a moment. He was right about you, she said. He told me, in his letter, go to Baker Street if you need help. He had read about you. He trusted you without meeting you. He was perceptive, Holmes said dryly. Most people require a meeting. She smiled at this, the first smile I had seen from her. She left Baker Street that afternoon and London the following week, taking the completed Chancery papers and the loom shuttle wrapped in its cloth and the settlement that the Chancery proceedings had produced, which was imperfect and incomplete and considerably better than nothing. Holmes was back at his desk within the hour, working on something unrelated. This is how it always is in these cases. The resolution arrives, and then the case closes, and then the desk is occupied by the next thing, and the world goes on. The mechanism of attention that makes Holmes extraordinary in action simply redirects itself with the same completeness that it had applied to the next thing. There is no ceremony of conclusion. The case was. The case is done. The next case is. I find this both admirable and occasionally difficult to reconcile with my own sense of how things should end. The cases I have been part of with Holmes do not end cleanly. They end when the legal process ends, or when the perpetrators are arrested, or when the question that prompted the investigation is answered. But the human weight of them continues. Auguste Vautier is still dead. The Vautier family lost 174 years of the income that should have been theirs. Clest went back to Lyon without her grandfather, and with a sum of money that couldn't repair what was taken. Holmes knows this. He is not unsentimental. He simply understands that what he can do and what he cannot do are in a fixed relationship, and that wishing that relationship were different is not a productive use of an intelligence that is needed elsewhere. But he played the violin for 2 hours that evening, and he sent the shuttle. The silk hangs now in the Victoria and Albert Museum, in the Textile Gallery, in a case that gives it the light it deserves, La Tourterelle. Design 3 of Jean-Pierre Vautier's series of 7. The turtle doves in the pattern are rendered in cream and gold thread so fine that they look, in the right light, like they might move. They were designed by a man of 32 who had crossed the Channel with his wife and 3 children to reach a country where he could practice his religion and his craft without persecution. He spent 30 years of his prime working life making the best things he knew how to make. He was ruined by someone who had more power than conscience. He died in a fire. His family kept weaving. 174 years later, his great-great-great-grandson came to London with the silk as evidence of what had been taken, and died for it. And his granddaughter, 25 years old, with the composed patience of someone who had been told the story all her life and had decided that the story required an ending, built the case that ended it. The silk is in the museum. The doves are still, and somewhere in Lyon there is a loom from 1730, and a family that kept faith with what they knew how to make, and a shuttle with initials carved in the wood that is back where it belongs after 272 years. These are the things that Holmes and I were part of for 1 October in London. The fog, and the Canal, and the Guildhall archive, and the Belgravia hall, the old man with the weaver's hands, and the young woman with the composure of someone who had been waiting her whole life for the right moment. The silk on the wall of a house that had displayed it as heritage, and the silk in the coat lining of the man who carried it as proof. All of it is, now, in the past. A particular past of 1 October, 1 Canal, 1 murder, 1 claim settled long after the people who suffered the original crime had died. The past where the injustice lived for 174 years before it was addressed, and where what was addressed was the legal record but not the human cost, which is always higher than the settlement. And yet, the silk is in the museum. And the patterns are preserved, and Jean-Pierre Vautier's name is on a label in the textile gallery of the Victoria and Albert Museum, visible to anyone who goes to look. He made things well because he trusted that well-made things outlast the circumstances of their making. He was right. Let the thought settle. You have been in the Guildhall archive, with its boxes of fragile paper and its records of weavers who fought for their craft with the tools available to them, petitions and legal filings, and the patient documentation of injustice accumulate. You have been on the Regent's Canal towpath in the October dark, and in a Belgravia hall where the evidence of an old crime hung on the wall. You have been in the presence of a young woman who spent 3 weeks doing the difficult, quiet work of gathering what was needed, in the house of the people who had taken what was not theirs, without anyone knowing who she was or what she was. You can let all of that rest now. The archive holds what it holds. There was a moment in the Ravenswood Hall that I should describe properly, because it contains something the rest of the account cannot. Lady Cecily Ravenswood, sitting in the hall chair after Holmes had gone upstairs to find Clest, looked at the framed silk on the wall with the expression of someone who has been looking at something for 30 years and has only at this moment seen it clearly. The frames held 5 pieces in total, each mounted behind glass, the labels below them in the brass script of pride and... Do you know what the labels used to say? She said, not looking at me. What did they say? They used to say, the family pieces. Just that. No date, no attribution, no claim. My father-in-law changed them in 1871 when the British textile industry was celebrating 100 years of dominance, and he thought the history should be acknowledged. She looked at the turtle dove silk. He commissioned a historian to document the family's contribution to Spitalfields. The historian found a reference in a trade journal from 1730, Croft Manufacturing, a description of their finest silk as incorporating what the journal called the nouvelle technique of a continental master. He told my father-in-law this was a reference to the Croft family having learned from French techniques during Huguenot immigration. He never found the Vautier record, I said. He either never found it, or he found it and advised my father-in-law accordingly, she said. I don't know which. I was married into this family in 1845. By then the labels had been on the frames for 25 years, and the history was settled. She looked at the silk. I started to understand something was wrong in 1862. I found a letter in my husband's desk, an old letter, from the 1820s, from his grandfather to his father, that mentioned the Vautier name. Just mentioned it. The letter was about a solicitor's advice regarding a potential claim from a French family. The advice was that any such claim would be extremely difficult to pursue across jurisdictions and across the time elapsed. His grandfather was worried about a claim, I said. His grandfather knew exactly what the claim would be, she said. He knew what the La Tourterelle was. He knew who had made it. She was quiet for a moment. I asked my husband about it. He told me it was ancient history and had no legal standing, and I was not to think about it. She looked at her hands. I did not think about it. But I did not act. And that is the same as the choice my father-in-law made, and my grandfather-in-law and his father. We all decided not to act. She paused. And Moshe Vautier is dead because of that. I did not answer, because there was no answer that would have served the moment. She was right. The accumulation of decisions not to act had produced a situation where the only action Edward Ravenswood could conceive of, the not acting, had been a kind of choice. The choice not to face what they had. And that choice, multiplied across generations, had become the shape of the family. Holmes came back downstairs with Clesty, and the moment became something different, and I have given you what it was. But I keep returning to Lady Ravenswood's face at Baker Street on the evening of the day we first visited the Ravenswood house. Holmes sat for a long time with the photograph he had taken of the silk, the close photograph, taken with the best lens at his disposal, showing the full width of the pattern at a resolution that let you see the individual. I sat across from him and watched him look at it. He was not using his own lens. He was looking at the photograph with his naked eye, tilting it in the lamplight, changing the angle. He was doing something that was not quite reading and not quite looking. "What do you see?" I asked. "The structure of the design," he said. "Not just the visible structure, the underlying one." He tilted the photo. Jean-Pierre Vautier was also a minister in his congregation's church, a Calvinist lay minister. He led religious services for his community in the years after the revocation, when official worship was dangerous. He paused. The Huguenot community in Spitalfields was, in 1687 and for some years afterward, a community. Not persecution in England, the English were on their side, but the networks of information that flowed between the French Protestant diaspora communities across Europe were fragile and sometimes dangerous. A name in the wrong place, sent to the wrong party in France, could result in serious consequences for family members still there. He needed ways to communicate that couldn't be intercepted, I said. He needed ways to preserve information that couldn't be destroyed or attributed, Holmes said. He looked at the photograph. The point papers that record the designs are extraordinary documents of technical precision. But they are also, in a Vautier design, something else. He set down the photograph. I noticed it first. The point paper for La Tourterelle, which I photographed, contains a section in the middle ground of the design, between the main turtle dove motif and the border, where the threading instructions become irregular. Irregular how? Not irregular in the sense of error, in the sense of deviation from the pure aesthetic logic of the design. A designer of Vautier's calibre would not make accidental deviations. Every decision in these designs is deliberate, so the deviations are deliberate. He stood and went to his bookcase and came back with a sheet of paper on which he had made notes in his small, rapid hand. I am not a cryptographer, but I know the general principles, and the general principle that applies here is substitution. A regular grid of positions, the threading grid of a point paper, can carry an encoded text if you establish a key that maps positions to letters. He encoded text into the pattern, I said. I believe he encoded names, Holmes said. The names of members of his congregation, people with families still in France who needed their identities protected, people who had converted to Protestantism secretly and whose names, if discovered by French agents operating in London, could have led to consequences. He built a record of his flock into the thing he trusted most. I was very quiet. A hidden registry, I said. Hidden in the most permanent place he could find, Holmes said. The silk patterns, the most durable record in Spitalfields, the things built to outlast their makers. He looked at his notes. The 7 designs together, if I am right, would contain a complete register of his congregation at some period between 1688 and 1720. Does the register matter now? Holmes looked at me. In a practical sense, no. The people whose names are encoded have been dead for 200 years. The danger they faced has been long resolved. He paused. But, in another sense, yes. Because it means that what Aldous Croft stole in 1720 was not simply patterns. It was a community's history. A congregation's record. The names of people who trusted their minister to protect them, encoded into his life's work. He looked at the photograph of the silk. And the Ravenswood family has been displaying that record on their wall, in a hall in Belgravia, not knowing what it contained. He sat back down. I haven't fully decoded it, he said. I would need all 7 designs simultaneously to do that properly, and I have access to 5. With Clests 2, I might be able to establish the complete text. That is not the legal case. That is something else entirely. I looked at the photograph of the silk. The turtle doves rested in their botanical frame, woven in cream and gold against the deep watercolor of the background. They were exactly what they appeared to be. They were also, if Holmes was right, something more. The carrier of something that Jean-Pierre Vautier had not wanted to trust in a world where paper could burn and silk could not. Silk burns. Holmes would have corrected me on that. But the point papers, the loom instructions could survive what the workshop fire could not, if they had been carried out of the building before it burned. By a family that understood what they held and what it meant, and that the time to use it had not yet come. 174 years. Watson arrived. I should say something about Watson, because he was present for the final stages of the case, and because his presence in Baker Street in those days had a quality that I always appreciated. Watson was a man of clear and genuine intelligence who understood, after years with Holmes, exactly when to speak and exactly when to listen, and who had developed the additional capacity, which is rarer than it sounds, to understand when a room needed him to simply be in it, uncomplicated and present. He arrived from his practice in Paddington at read the case papers Holmes had left on the table for him with the rapid focused attention of a man who has been doing this for years, and said 3 things in succession. The canal. Cold water. He would have survived approximately 2 hours. He didn't go in alive, Holmes said. No, but knowing the timing. The canal men found him at first light. He looked at Holmes. That puts him in the water between 10 and midnight. We know the man from Kellerman's went out at 9:30. So the killing was on dry land first, and then the water. Yes, Holmes said. Then the canal was chosen for disposal, not for the method. Watson set down the papers. Which means the killing place and the disposal place are different. Where was he killed? Holmes looked at him. I have been circling that question, and I believe I have been wrong to circle it. The killing happened somewhere between the lodging house in Shoreditch and the canal basin. He went out. He met someone. He was killed. The meeting was probably at a location suggested by the killer. He looked at Watson. Not on the towpath, that would have been too exposed, and Parker described the canal man as having the body with him, implying he transported it from elsewhere to the water. A private location, Watson said. Something the killer controlled. Holmes turned to a map he had pinned to the wall, a large-scale map of the area between Shoreditch and Camden, covering the stretch of the canal and the streets adjacent to it. Kellerman's boat hire is here, he said, marking the map. The canal basin is here. between Shoreditch and the Basin. On the south side, there are 3 sets of warehouse premises that were active in 1895. 2 of them are fabric warehouses. One is a silk warehouse. He paused. Ravenswood Import and Storage, Commercial Canal Wharf. Watson looked at the map. Edward Ravenswood owns a warehouse on the canal, Watson said. He does. And it has a private loading dock. And a man who wants to show an old French weaver the extent of his commercial operation might plausibly suggest meeting there. Holmes pulled on his coat. I didn't find this yesterday because I was thinking about the canal as a disposal site rather than as a location Ravenswood regularly used. Watson, you are occasionally more useful than you know. Only occasionally, Watson said dryly. Reaching the Ravenswood Canal warehouse was locked and dark when we got there. Holmes examined it with the lens and found what he expected, or the beginning of what he expected. The private loading dock on the canal side had marks that were consistent with the body having been moved from the warehouse interior to the dock, from the dock to the boat. The interior of the warehouse, when Lestrade's men forced entry the following morning, showed the rest of it. A section of floor near the back of the building, recently cleaned, but not cleaned well enough to conceal what had happened there from the forensic attention of a medical man and a detective. Edward Ravenswood had brought Auguste Vautier to his own warehouse. He had shown him the scale of the operation, built on what the Vautier family had made. And then he had hit him from behind with a section of metal pipe that was found behind a box of raw silk in the corner of the warehouse, wiped but not wiped clean enough. The pipe had on it traces of both blood and raw silk dust. It told its story clearly enough. Lestrade, when all of this was placed before him, had the expression of a man receiving a completed document. He looked at the evidence, looked at Holmes and said, "That is sufficient." "It is more than sufficient," Holmes said. "The murder charge is complete. The fraud case will take longer, but the foundation is in the Guildhall archive." "You're going to find the man?" Lestrade said. "He went to Charing Cross this morning," Holmes said. "If he is still in the country, someone will find him. If he is already on the continent, that is a different negotiation." He was still in the country. He had not, it turned out, been able to get on the train. There is something about the nature of guilt, at its most comprehensive, that produces paralysis rather than action. Edward Ravenswood had made a calculation, killed a man, disposed of the body, and then spent 10 days waiting for the investigation to arrive at his door. When it arrived, when Holmes and I appeared at the Belgravia Hall, and his mother called for him, and he wasn't there, he had taken a cab to Charing Cross and stood on the platform with a Trevelyan case and not boarded a train. I have thought about this often since. He had done what he had done. He had spent 10 days living with it, in the house where Clester Vautier was gathering evidence 3 floors above him, in the office building in Commercial Street, where Auguste Vautier had never arrived for the meeting Edwards had apparently arranged there as a cover story. He had gone to his club. He had eaten his meals. He had attended a civic committee meeting on the Thursday after the murder, according to the minutes. And then he stood on the platform at Charing Cross and couldn't get on the train. The calculation that had killed Auguste Vautier was the calculation of a man who had decided that preserving a fortune was worth a life. The paralysis on the platform was the moment when that calculation stopped working, when the thing it had been meant to protect, the feeling of being a Ravenswood, of being the kind of person who lived in a house with the La Tourterelle silk on the wall, had been revealed by the act of violence itself, as the kind of thing that cannot be protected by violence. You cannot preserve something real by doing something that makes it false. You cannot protect an inheritance by committing a crime, because the crime becomes part of the inheritance. He knew this on the platform. That was why he couldn't get on the train. Holmes, characteristically, was already thinking about the next thing when I offered this analysis. He listened with the partial attention of someone who has heard a version of this conclusion before and finds it accurate but unsurprising. The mathematics of that kind of decision always fails in the end, he said. The person who makes it never understands that they are also part of the calculation. They think they are external to it, the calculator, not one of the numbers. They are always one of the numbers. He went back to his desk. I sat in the armchair and thought about what he had said. He was right, of course. He was right in the way he was usually right, not entirely without feeling, but with the specific clarity that comes from having observed human beings making decisions for a long time and having identified, across that observation, the consistent shapes those decisions take. The person who commits a crime to protect something valuable always discovers that the crime destroys the value it was meant to protect. Not because the crime is discovered, sometimes it isn't, but because the person who committed it cannot stand inside the protected thing the same way they stood inside it before. Edward Ravenswood had lived in a Belgravia house with the La Tourterelle silk on the wall for 47 years. He had grown up in it. He had absorbed the sense of being the kind of person who lived in that house, was the inheritor of that silk, bore that name, possessed that heritage. The heritage was built on a theft, yes, but the feeling was real. He had killed an old man to protect the feeling. And the feeling had left him standing on a platform at Charing Cross, unable to get on a train. Because the platform was still inside the world, where the silk was on the wall, and the heritage was intact, and the train would take him somewhere where he was simply a man who had killed someone for money, and there was no version of that he could board. The constables found him there 20 minutes later. He came with them without resistance. The year that followed was the year of legal proceedings that I have described. The silk in the Guildhall archive, the point papers from August's satchel, donated by Clest, the Chancery hearing, the settlement, and after the settlement, after Clest had gone back to Lyon and the Ravenswood name had been in the newspapers for the last of what would be many months, Holmes did one more thing. He wrote a paper. It was not a paper for the general press. It was a paper for the Huguenot Society's Proceedings, the academic journal that had been publishing research on Huguenot history since 1885. The paper documented, for the first time in a complete form, the evidence of Jean-Pierre Vautier's encoding system in the 7 designs. Not the full decoded text, Holmes was careful about that, conscious of the families and their descendants, but the method, the mathematics of the substitution cipher. The key embedded in La Tourterelle's border. The evidence that a Huguenot minister in 1690 Spitalfields had created, as a matter of pastoral duty and practical necessity, the most sophisticated information hiding system in the English textile industry. The paper was received with considerable interest by the specialists. It was reviewed in the textile history journals. It was cited in subsequent scholarship on Huguenot design practices. Holmes showed me the published version once, briefly, before it went back onto the shelf. He said nothing about it beyond showing me the page. He was already involved in something else. But the dedication page, which I saw in the moment before he returned it to the shelf, read, "For the memory of Jean-Pierre Vautier, master weaver of Spitalfields, who trusted the work to carry what paper could not." This is what the work of that October amounts to, in the end. A man came from France with evidence of a wrong. He was killed for bringing it. His granddaughter finished the work he had started. Holmes provided the mechanism for finishing it. The silk is in a museum. The names of a congregation, encoded in a pattern, are the subject of a scholarly paper in a historical journal. And somewhere in Lyon, a loom from 1730 continues to work. That is the ordinary miracle of it. Not the investigation, not the legal proceedings, not the confrontation in the Belgravia hall. The ordinary miracle is the loom. The family that kept weaving for 174 years after the theft, not in anger, not in performance of a grievance, but because weaving is what they did, because the knowledge of how to make extraordinary things does not evaporate in a fire or disappear in a legal setback. It lives in the hands of the people who practice it. Holmes understood this. He said something to Watson one evening in the later stages of the proceedings that Watson thought to write down and that he told me about later. The Ravenswood family displayed the silk as heritage, Holmes said. The Vautier family made it. The family that makes a thing and the family that displays it are not the same thing, even when the displayed thing was taken from the making family. The making continues. The displaying is the lesser operation. Watson had nodded and said, the Vautiers had the better of it, even in loss. They had the better of it in the sense that what they possessed was not possessible by it, Holmes said. You can steal a design. You cannot steal the capacity to make another. He picked up the violin. Watson picked up his notebook and wrote that down. The silk in the museum case catches the light in October the same way it caught the firelight in Baker Street when Holmes had it unrolled across the table and was looking at it through his lens. That deep watercolor. The turtle doves in the border where the encoding sits, patient and precise, waiting to be read by someone with the right kind of attention. Jean-Pierre Vautier made it in 1692 in a house on Princelet Street, Spitalfields, with his wife and children around him, and a canary in a cage beside the loom for company while he worked. It is still working. The morning after the discovery of the body, before we went, Holmes worked at the Baker Street desk for 2 hours with the photograph of the silk, his notes from the archive, and 3 reference volumes that he pulled from the shelves, with the purposeful efficiency of someone who has been organizing a personal library for years and knows exactly where everything is. I watched him work, because watching Holmes in the analytical phase of a case is itself an education in attention. He worked in 3 registers simultaneously. The first was the visual examination of the photograph, which he returned to every few minutes, tilting it in the lamplight, studying different sections of the pattern at different angles. The second was the archive notes, which he read and reread in a way that suggested he was building a structure from them rather than simply reviewing their content. The third was one of the reference volumes, a technical study of 18th century Spitalfields silk production published in 1882, which he had opened at the chapter on pattern design and attribution. He said at one point, without looking up, "Do you know what a draw loom is?" "Broadly," I said. "The draw loom is the instrument that made the Spitalfields silk industry what it was," he said, still reading. A standard loom operates through a mechanical principle that limits the complexity of pattern it can produce. The draw loom adds a secondary system of threads, the drawboy's threads, or later, the jacquard mechanism, that allows the weaver to program the loom to produce almost unlimited pattern variation. The complexity achievable on a draw loom is not bounded by the loom's mechanics, but by the patience and skill of the person designing the point paper that instructs it. And Jean-Pierre Vautier was the best, I said. Jean-Pierre Vautier was, according to 3 contemporary accounts that I have now traced, not merely the best working designer in Spitalfields, but someone who had pushed the technique to a point that other weavers had not understood was achievable. He turned a page. One contemporary account from a 1715 periodical describes seeing a piece of La Tourterelle silk in the possession of a mercer in Covent Garden. The writer says, I am paraphrasing, that the silk appeared to contain a depth that could not be accounted for by the flat surface of the fabric, that looking at it was like looking into water. He closed the book. What he had done, what the technique achieves in Vautier's hands, is something that later analysts have called trompe-l'oeil weaving, the manipulation of thread direction and color gradation to create the optical impression of three-dimensional depth in a flat surface. Not an effect produced by the thread pile, as in velvet, but an effect produced entirely by the pattern, by the arrangement of colored threads in relation to each other. He looked at the photograph. This is what Aldous Croft wanted. Not just the commercial value of the patterns, the technique, the knowledge of how to produce an effect that no one else could produce. He stood and went to the window, and it is what the Vautier family kept in Lyon, while the Ravenswood family kept only the patterns. He looked down at Baker Street. The Ravenswoods could reproduce the design. They could weave the turtle dove motif, the botanical border, the color scheme. But the technical depth, the trompe l'oeil quality that made Vautier's work unmistakable, that requires the knowledge that produces it. The knowledge lived in the hands of the family. It could not be stolen. He turned. Augustus Vautier's 2 yards of silk sewn into his coat lining it has the depth. The Ravenswood commercial production, which I have now seen in their pattern archives, does not. It is competent, it is handsome. It is not what Jean-Pierre Vautier made. He sat back down at the desk. The family kept the better thing, he said involuntarily, because what makes something excellent is not the pattern, but the understanding that produces the pattern. An understanding cannot be confiscated. He picked up his pen. Remember that. I have remembered it. The session in the Ravenswood sitting room, where Cleste told us what she had gathered, lasted 2 hours. In that time she went through every piece of evidence methodically, in the order she had gathered it, and in the order that she had clearly decided, made the strongest case. She had the instincts of someone who had grown up hearing a legal argument told and retold until its structure was second nature. Holmes listened in the way he listened when he was doing 2 things at once, absorbing the content and assessing the person presenting it. He asked questions occasionally, brief and precise, and each question produced an answer that extended the evidence rather than merely repeating it. Midway through the session, he asked her, "Your grandfather told you to keep the 2 point papers separate from each other. You had them. He had 2 others in his satchel, and the Guildhall held 5. Why did he separate them?" She looked at him. "Because he knew," she said. "He always said, a message is only as safe as the least safe place it is kept. If the point papers had been all together and someone found them, they would have the complete message. Separated, they are each incomplete." She paused. He also said that the complete message was not the point. The claim could be made without it. The complete message was for the historians. Holmes was very still for a moment. He intended the hidden registry to be decoded, Holmes said. Eventually, when the time was right, when there was no danger in knowing those names. He looked at her. He had read my work. He had read about you, she said. He said, "There is someone in London who decodes things." He said, "If anything goes wrong, find him. He will know what the silk contains." Holmes looked at the window. He trusted a great deal to accident, he said. He trusted a great deal to the kind of people who attend to things that others overlook, she said. He said those people are not. He said they exist in every generation, if you know where to look for them. Holmes said nothing. She continued her testimony, and I sat in the corner of the room and thought about a 71-year-old man in Lyon, packing a satchel and sewing 2 yards of silk into his coat lining, trusting that the right attention would eventually find what he had brought. He was right. At Baker Street that night, after Watson had arrived and been briefed and gone to bed, Holmes and I sat for a while by the fire. "The hidden registry," I said. "Are you going to decode it fully?" He had the photograph of the silk in his hand. He had had it all evening, turning it occasionally, looking at different sections under the lamp. I am going to document the method, he said. The full decoding the names themselves I am going to leave to the Huguenot Society and their historians. They will know better than I do what to do with names that are 200 years old. He set the photograph down. What I can contribute is the proof that the method exists, that Jean-Pierre Vautier did what I believe he did, that the designs are not merely beautiful, that they are documents. He looked at the fire. He made beautiful things that were also true things, Holmes said. That is not an achievement that diminishes with age. He picked up the violin. Sleep, he said, which in Baker Street meant that the working part of the evening was complete, and the other part, the part that music does, which is not quite work and not quite rest, but something in between, was beginning. I stayed for the music. And then I was somewhere else, the way I always eventually am, but the fire in the grate burns on without me, and the silk is in its case, and the doves are exactly where they were built to be. Let yourself rest now, in the middle of this. You have been in the places where this story happened, the canal towpath, the archive rooms, the halls of old houses, the small sitting room where a young woman sat very still and absorbed something enormous and then said, I have the evidence. You have been in Baker Street by the fire, and in the warehouse by the canal, and on the platform at Charing Cross where a man stood with a travelling case and couldn't get on a train. You have heard the story of a man who trusted the work to carry what paper couldn't, and whose trust was vindicated not in his lifetime, not even in his children's lifetimes, but eventually, in the fullness of a very long time, by people who kept faith with what he had made. Let that be a comfort. The things that are made well, with care and attention and faith in the future, they do tend to survive. Not always, not easily, not without cost, but they tend towards survival in the way that anything built with truth in it tends towards survival. Because the truth in it is what makes it durable. The loom is still working, the doves are still in the pattern. The night holds London in its quiet hands, and you are here, in the dark, exactly where you are, with all the long hours of a good night's sleep still ahead of you. Let the October chill stay outside. Let the fire be what a fire is. Let the clocks count the distance to morning in their patient way. You don't need to hold anything tonight. The silk is in its case. The patterns are preserved. And the doves have always been there, woven into the fabric of a thing that was made to last, by hands that knew what they were doing and trusted that it mattered. It did. It does. Sleep gently, dear traveller. The work is done. Until next time.